Well, investment governance is the way in which decisions are made about the investment pool for which the trustee is responsible. Why is it become so important? Because it's been recognised that obviously the assets in the pension scheme are very important in driving the overall funding position of the scheme, and because assets are risky, the impact of the deficit can be quite substantial. I think it's become much more complex over the last few years, both in terms of understanding the relationship between the assets and the liabilities, and between understanding all the different asset classes that are available and all the liability mitigation tools that are available.
Well, trustees are now being faced with people ringing them at night and day saying, I've got this new kind of fund or this new kind of asset and we'd like you to have a look at it. And trustees should be open to new investments all the time, that's their job. But I think it's quite important to adopt a rule which is on page 1 of Teach Yourself to be a Trustee, which says you should only invest in things you understand. And there's no shame in saying you don't understand. And if you don't understand, don't invest in it. I mean, I have sat in trustee meetings when quite simple products have been brought along by investment managers for us to invest in. And the way that they've explained it has been so complicated that even I wouldn't invest in it. So I think if the salesman can't explain what he's doing in relatively simple language that an interested layman can understand, then don't do it.
Well, I think all Greek letters should be removed from any presentation to trustees. It's completely unacceptable, really. And so alpha and beta are not concepts at all. They're just notations to enable people to make this seem more complicated than it need be. And I would encourage any trustee to reject the use of those terms and any other Greek letters, in fact.
Don't be blinded by science. I mentioned that. If you don't understand jargon, ask. And if any manager comes across as having all the answers, then probably show him the door immediately.
Either find someone who you trust who will help you manage it, or don't do it. Would be a very clear choice, really. So if you don't understand it, fine. That doesn't mean you should rule it out, but you should look to work with someone who does understand it, and you should have a strong sense of trust in your relationship with that individual or company. And if you can't get that sense of trust, then leave it alone. There'll be other opportunities.
The biggest misallocation of resource is when trustees move too far along the spectrum from non-executive supervisor to executive doer. I think trusteeship should be all about strategy, supervision, monitoring those who work on your behalf. The biggest misallocation is when you try and do the job that somebody else could do much better than you could do.
Trustees should think of themselves as in the same way that corporate boards think of themselves. So they have a job to do, they have a set objective, they should sit down and work out what are their priorities, what needs to happen this year, what needs to happen in the longer term, and they therefore should have clarity about what they're measuring their own performance against. People can help them do that, all sorts of advisors will help them do that, but ultimately that is the one decision that must be made by the set of trustees. So they should have clarity about their objectives, and then they should measure their performance.
In the old days, you would spend 2 or 3 hours of valuable trustee time meeting your investment managers to review what they've been doing for you over the last quarter. I would much rather that people spent that time thinking strategically, having a debate among themselves, talking to their consultants if they have one, and indeed talking to their asset managers, but talking to their asset managers in a strategic learning environment rather than this staid, old, barren reporting framework where we use valuable time looking at what happened yesterday and forget that yesterday is gone, tomorrow is far more important.
They should spend some time each year discussing their own effectiveness. So what have been their strengths and weaknesses? Where have they been able to contribute effectively? Where have they felt that they've not been able to have the skill sets to challenge their advisors or to take advantage of an opportunity? So much more realism about self-assessment, I think, would be a really important step forward.
I would plead with trustees to spend much more time on asset allocation. If I go to a trustee meeting, I can pretty well guarantee that for most meetings, asset allocation will be less than 10% of the time. it's probably worth 10 times more than manager selection. Most people now don't put very much of use in their statement of investment principles. They merely comply with the law, and often you may have a completely separate document which is designed to be user-friendly and which does contain the realistic objectives and risk profiles that you're trying to achieve. So I would say it's a great pity that legislation in this case has been largely counterproductive.
I think it's largely a useless document, and it exists because it was a requirement to have it, and in most pension schemes it sets out a very basic statement of what the policy is so that it can be delivered and read by other people, but by and large they don't. So I think as an exercise in improving the way in which schemes operate, its impact is trivial. That's not to say there shouldn't be a document which sets out the way in which the trustees want to manage the assets of the scheme. That could be quite helpful as a concept.
I think the statement can be as good as you want it to be. And the more effort you put into producing a good document which sets out very clearly the aims, objectives of the fund, how you're going to invest the money, how the responsibilities are, it's a useful check as you're making decisions going forward as to are you complying with your overall aims and ambitions. If you produce a very poor document that doesn't lay out anything at all, then it won't be very much help.
You do see on the smaller pension funds where they don't have the resource to really rebuild an SIP. They will just go through the motions or photocopy somebody else's. That's unhelpful. But what there isn't, what the regulatory framework struggles with is proportionality. What's necessary and appropriate for a very large pension fund is not necessarily appropriate for a smaller pension fund. Pension funds need to get to understand that they're not going to be as sophisticated as the big pension funds if they're small. And they don't need to be. The law doesn't require them to be, and they shouldn't have to be.
Everybody is conscious that we say don't be short-termist, but then there's quarterly returns and pressure builds if returns are disappointing. I think the most important thing is to be clear as the explanation behind the returns. And there are very poor managers, and you shouldn't just sit with somebody hopeful, wishful thinking, triumph of hope over reality, and just think, oh, I mustn't be short-term about it.
If you've given the manager a specific mandate, you have to think carefully, is there any way he or she could have achieved that given the constraints you put upon them? So you may give a property manager a long-term target of beating inflation plus something or other. In the markets we've seen in the last 2 years, there's no way a property manager investing in commercial property could have delivered a positive return. Now, should you fire him because you asked him to invest in property? Not because anything he's done wrong, it was a trustee decision. So it's trying to understand whose decision it is and where the problem is. And it may be a strategic asset allocation problem rather than a fund manager stock selection problem.
Trustees can be too trusting. And historically it's not been too bad, but in current circumstances where we've seen that the big houses, the big investment houses, the Goldman Sachs's and the Bear Stearns and the Merrill Lynch's have all got feet of clay. We really need to rethink how trustees deal with investment advisors and investment consultants. They are not the fount of all wisdom. They do know more than you or me, but they could be wrong.
I don't think there's an ideal constitution. I don't think you actually want a group of investment experts around the table. I think you want a group of lay people who are prepared to learn and to understand and to challenge the input they're getting from their advice and their managers, and to take the common sense approach. Yes, they'll need to build up their knowledge of areas, but I think they should continue to manage as a group of lay trustees with this challenge mechanism in place, that always challenging why are you suggesting that, why are you advising that, what happens if this goes wrong, and not just sort of taking what other people are telling them. So that's what we look for, is a proper challenge, I think.
I think the most important advice is, for goodness sake, take on a chief investment officer. Be prepared to pay what it costs to take somebody good out of the private sector, and let that chief investment officer set your asset allocation.
You have to continually go around that iterative circle. Who are we, or who might we be? What do we want to do? And how much resource can we commit to it?
So I would say you need a good chairman, a good series of subcommittees, and a lot less bureaucracy than we've got now, because I actually believe that's hampering good governance.
they have to make a compromise somewhere, and that compromise might either be in saying we can't do what we would like to do, or we have to find some way of delegating tasks to someone else. If we think that there are things that we need to do and that not doing them will make us suboptimal, then we have to find someone else to do them on our behalf. It's our job then to manage the doers rather than become doers ourselves.